Thanks very much, Tom. Good afternoon to you. It's great to be here, be able to talk about this very crucial part of the story of the term that we're looking at. The last week of May in 2005 was a momentous one for John Howard. On the Thursday of that week, on May 26, he rose in the House of Reps and declared his intention to introduce and implement what stood to be the biggest and most transformative reform during his time as Prime Minister, a comprehensive recasting of the nation's workplace laws, a set of proposals that would dwarf his previous forays into that area as PM. They were the Workplace Relations Act of 1996 and the Waterfront Reforms of 1997-98. These new reforms would later be entitled Work Choices and would come to play a very important role in his fourth term as Prime Minister. As I say, it was a big week for John Howard. The day after he told the nation that he wanted to remake its labour market, he travelled to Melbourne and he had lunch with me. That was actually meant to be a joke, but we did actually have lunch. We sat around a table in the Age building with 3 or 4 of my senior editorial colleagues, and I can see from his expression that he's recalling every moment of that lunch right now. It was a time, I think, that it was very clear in being around Mr. Howard that he was relaxed and feeling good about where he'd got himself in his career, and that was understandable. He'd made his landmark announcement and he was only a little over a month away from commanding a majority in the Senate, and it was all coming together for him at last. We know now that things didn't work out the way that he would have hoped, at least not in the political sense. I admit to being anxious at that lunch, because at that time I was writing the Saturday political column for The Age, and as the conversation flowed, my deadline was fast approaching, and of course I had to write about this great announcement. But I couldn't miss out on what the Prime Minister had to say. I did eventually make it back to my desk to write that column, the press has rolled and all those other cliches. Tom has encouraged us to reflect on our own contemporary assessments in our presentations, what we got right and what we got wrong. So I'll read you the first couple of lines of my column. I'll force you into basically becoming my readers, which is always the journalist's prerogative, I think. 154 years have passed since Henry Bourne-Higgins was born in County Down, Ireland, and 135 since he arrived in the colony of Victoria with his family and went on to become the father of industrial arbitration in Australia. He ceased to be a judge 84 years ago, but only now is Higgins' passing complete. John Howard is now smashing every last vestige of Higgins' considerable legacy. In doing so, the Prime Minister is triggering one of the greatest policy revolutions in post-war Australia. In my view, the new workplace rules announced by Howard and Workplace Relations Minister Kevin Andrews on Thursday represent the biggest political event since Gough Whitlam's dismissal in 1975. They will transform the way we live, work, relate to each other and do business. Hardly an Australian will be untouched. The impact of the new workplace laws should not be underestimated. The transformation of this country under these changes will be immense. I might have overcooked it a bit. It was clear that while the detail was not yet worked out, this would be a seismic shift. Although the government was concentrating more at that time for its messaging on the changes to unfair dismissal laws rather than the changes in basic entitlements, which would come to be much more of a focus in public discussion and the political debate over those laws. Anyway, I think I got that part of it right, but I got something else profoundly wrong in that column, and I'll read, there's a bit of self-flagellation going on here, but I'll read you what I then said. Naturally, the unions and the Labor Party will campaign vigorously against these changes. It's hard to see how their campaign will change the outcome of the new laws or adversely affect the political fortunes of the government, especially if the economy continues to grow. Unionism is in chronic decline in Australia. Not only notions of collective action, but the very concepts of what constitute an employer and an employee have been changing rapidly since 1993. Now, I don't know, how wrong can you get? something, because I got that incredibly wrong. Even as the Prime Minister was supping at the Age's table, the ACTU, under the leadership of its Secretary Greg Combet and his Lieutenant George Wright, was well advanced in devising and implementing one of the most effective public campaigns in modern Australian history. Its television ads, notably the ad in which single mother Tracy was told by her boss that she had to leave her son at home alone and come into work if she wanted to keep a job, started running a month later. They were devastatingly successful in turning public opinion against work choices. In a survey the ACTU commissioned in May 2005, just after the government had announced work choices, 38% of respondents said they knew a lot or something about government plans to change the workplace laws. And 36% said they thought those changes would be bad for the average worker, right? So 38% not awareness, 36% saying it's bad. 3 months later, they polled again. This was after the ads had been running for a couple of months. Awareness had risen to 77%, and now 64%, compared with 36%, thought the changes would be bad for ordinary people. The common take about work choices, that the re-elected Howard government took a punt on a massive reform without conditioning the public to understand and embrace it, and paid a heavy price, is beyond challenge, I suppose. That's the way it seems to me. During the 2004 election, the Coalition's workplace relations policy included some suggestions, mild versions of work choices. They related to independent contractors, labour hire, federal-state harmonisation, but they didn't talk about stripping back the basic elements of the no disadvantage test, and they didn't talk about the unfair dismissal laws. But only a little more than a month after the election, Governor-General Michael Jeffrey, in his speech to open the new parliament, said the fourth-term Howard government would accelerate the reform of workplace relations. The chief problem for the government is that a reform of that size involves a massive piece of legislation, which takes a lot of time to prepare, to consult, to present. Having tipped its hand in November 2004, the legislation wasn't unveiled for another 12 months, giving the ACTU plenty of time to get its campaign going and its messages into the public consciousness. Work choices was a very big move towards deregulation of the labour market. It created barriers to union representation and collective bargaining, and made it much easier for employers to cut wages and sack workers should they want to do so. It effectively started dismantling the award system, stopping it dead from creating new awards. It pushed aside the Industrial Relations Commission, neutering its wage-setting power in favour of another, smaller tribunal that would set wages for the low-paid. Under work choices, individual contracts or Australian workplace agreements, as they'd been named in the previous legislation, no longer had to meet the old no disadvantage test. They only had to comply with 5 basic employment standards written into the legislation: minimum wage rates, ordinary working hours of 38 hours a week, 4 weeks annual leave, 10 days sick leave, and 12 months unpaid parental leave. This opened the way for employers to negotiate away existing entitlements like penalty rates for shift work, overtime pay rates, and allowances. After the legislation was tabled, it was still another 4 months before work choices became law in March 2006. That time lag again allowed the ACTU, not just in its paid advertising, but in its days of action, in which thousands of workers turned up to various events and marched in the streets, and its on-the-ground campaign in 24 marginal coalition seats, to speak with certainty, or what they deemed certainty, about what work choices would mean, while the Minister, Kevin Andrews, had to speak with a mouthful of marbles. He, along with his Prime Minister, were forced to speak defensively against the ACTU onslaught. The problem was always the removal of the no disadvantage test, which had guaranteed that a worker's remuneration under an individual contract could never be less than the aggregate value of what he or she would have been paid under the relevant award. Eventually, changes were made. In January 2007, Andrews was replaced as the minister charged with overseeing work choices by Joe Hockey. 3 months later, a fairness test restored entitlements in individual contracts for workers earning up to $75,000 a year, which was basically the old no disadvantage test under a new rubric with given a different name. A whole new government advertising campaign spruiked these changes. The numbers may have gone up to maybe $100 million all up. The government lost, but of course they had no effect, and the government lost office as we know. Of the 25 seats that shifted to Labor in the election, 21 were in electorates targeted by the ACTU's Your Rights at Work campaign. The national swing to Labor across the board was 5.7%, and in the 24 Your Rights at Work target seats, the swing averaged 7%, so there's a differential there of 1.3%. The Australian election study showed that 51% of voters rated industrial relations as an extremely important issue in the 2007 election, up from 31% in 2004. Now, work choices wasn't the only negative issue for the government at that election, of course, but it was nonetheless a decisive political negative. But does work choices represent a policy failure? Paul Kelly has concluded that the upshot is that Howard's industrial legacy is equivocal. I'm not sure, 12 years on from the 2007 election defeat, that I can agree with that. Certainly, work choices had a toxic political effect on the Howard government, and it's rendered the coalition gun-shy of pursuing not just similar labour market reforms, but any real reforms beyond laws directed at harming specific unions and union officials, such as the CFMEU. And that's after 6 years in office. But work choices moved the deregulation dial permanently. Back in 2009 and all the way to the 2013 election, there was plenty of rhetoric from media commentators and many outraged Liberals about the Rudd government's Fair Work Act returning our industrial relations regime to the 1960s. The ACTU could only wish for that. Fair Work didn't revive the union movement. It didn't reignite national wage claims. It removed some of work choices' union right of entry restrictions, but not all that much. It didn't usher in a return to collective bargaining across the workforce. It didn't outlaw individual contracts. Now there are no wage pressures in the economy, essentially. Wages are stagnant. In the year to the end of September, wages rose by 2.2%. They're only just keeping pace with inflation. In big areas of employment, construction, manufacturing, retail, wage growth is less than 2%. Labour productivity has been running at 1.1% per year for the last 5 years, while real wages, as I've just said, have barely moved. On those raw figures, it could be that in that period, that 5-year period, employers have been able to increase their own incomes by an extra 4% or more. It hasn't gone to workers. Industrial action is increasingly a rarity. For the past 5 years, the number of days lost to strikes per 1,000 employees has toggled between 2 to 3 days. In the 1990s, more than 20 days was common. In 2004, when work choices was first conceived, 17 days per worker were lost due to strikes. That's quite a change. The union movement is barely a shadow of its former self. In 1976, early in Mr. Howard's parliamentary career, union membership sat at 51%. Now it's at 14%, with fewer than 1 in 10 private sector workers belonging to a union. The ACTU's ability to campaign effectively is seriously under question after its effort this year. The ACTU spent $10 million in the lead up to the 2019 election, including $6.5 million on advertising during the formal campaign. You may have forgotten, but the slogan was "Change the Rules." Most of those rules are actually devised by the previous Labor government, of course. The ACT's problems go all the way back to 2007 when Greg Combet left to enter Parliament. I think that was a crucial turning point. In fact, even before the election had happened, he'd handed over running of the campaign to Sharon Burrow, the president at the time. And of course, George Wright, who later went on to become the ALP National Secretary, left not long after, and the ACT has never recovered its mojo as a campaigning entity. I think that's fair to say. Collective bargaining is going backwards. According to the Centre for Future Work, the share of private sector workers covered by enterprise agreements has halved since this government came to power, and it's now just at 11%. The most important and effective Australian union leader of the past 40 years, Bill Kelty, has made it clear who he believes is responsible for some of that. He told a forum at La Trobe University only a few weeks ago, I won't do a Bill Kelty impersonation, but he said, what has happened since the GFC is the ability to bargain is less because the Labor Party did a terrible job when Gillard and Rudd were fixing the right to bargain. I love the Labor Party, but if that's the best they can do to ensure unions have a proper right to bargain, that was a terrible job they did. The reason the Fair Work Act has, in his view, I suppose, but I think more generally I'd take this view at why it's come up short, is because the Howard government did swing for the fence with work choices. Labor pulled back on some of it, but not in a transformative way. For John Howard, work choices came from a deeply held conviction. As a union minister in the Fraser government, he outlawed secondary boycotts by unions under the Trade Practices Act. In his first stint as Liberal leader, he helped inspire the formation of the H.R. Nichols Society. In 1993, as a shadow minister, he created the Jobs Back policy, a precursor to work choices. And when he learned that he had a Senate majority in 2004, well, he wasn't going to die wondering. He said a few months after the 2007 election loss, I wasn't going to dingo out. I actually believed in it. I was determined to do IR reform. I'd always thought that further industrial relations reform was critical. John Howard lost the battle, admittedly a pretty big battle, losing his seat into the bargain. But on workplace relations, history may judge that he won the war. Thanks.
Now, Shaun, we've talked before about the Workplace Relations Act 1997. We've talked about the MUA struggles 97-98, and you seem to have been more critical of those two than you are of work choices. Can you help us understand that? It's almost as though, with the benefit of hindsight, you're not seeing work choices as egregious as people might have expected.
Indeed. Well, in fact, I think I gave my talk at Retrospective number 2 years ago on the waterfront, and times moved on. And I think there's clearly the through line, if you like, was always that this was an important part of Mr. Howard's prescription for Australia, what he wanted to see happen. And I think we've moved on, and it seems inarguable to me now that there's no real route back for the trade union movement in Australia to become anything like what it used to be. But also I think there have been so many changes that have happened because of what was contained inside the Workplace Relations Act in 1996 that it didn't turbocharge change, but it planted the stake, and really so much has flowed from that. And the Labor Party didn't really put its shoulder to the wheel in trying to roll that back enough to have transformed things in the other direction. And with technological change, economic changes, we're never going to return to anything like what we used to have. So I regard that as basically a win for work choices.
So to speculate, how would it have been different if Peter Reith had been the IR Minister in the fourth Howard government and not Kevin Andrews? Can I entice you to speculate on what Peter might have done and how it might have been different to what Kevin did do?
Well, I mean, the difference would be that Peter was all in on the Workplace Relations Act from the very beginning, Peter Reith. I was fortunate enough to edit his diary, so I know the material reasonably well, and he was in lock, stock and barrel, whereas Kevin Andrews, with great respect to him, was one of the people in the cabinet table. I think I've read this in Lazarus Rising. He's one of the people arguing against, for example, on the unfair dismissal changes. So he was pushing back along with Tony Abbott. Peter Reith, well, he's a bit like a sort of political stuntman, really, wasn't he? He would happily jump out of the aeroplane, whether he had the parachute on or not, if he felt it would help,
So, but you're not saying, if Reith had stayed, say the full term of the Howard government, you're not suggesting they would have brought some of the elements of work choices earlier because they still needed the Senate to get them through, and that was never going to happen except for the unexpected gain in 2005.
Yeah, because it seems to me that it was the Senate majority that really mattered. You wanted to be able to do it cleanly, you didn't want to have to sort of shave it off, and because that wouldn't really be the reform that would be necessary, and you'd probably be cut so badly while you were doing it that you might not gain any as much policy benefit, certainly, but you'd also sustain similar type of political damage, I suspect.
And we had a little bit of a mini argument when we talked about the MUA and whether or not that experience had some, at least oral, audible legacy when it came to work choices. Do you see that the union movement learnt from the waterfront, applied it in your rights at work, and it's plainly the great success campaign of that in the last 30, 40 years? Do you still want to stand by that view that waterfront gave some insights, wisdom, whatever, which then was applied later? Although there's substantively different matters, I get that.
I understand, and I think, Mr. Howard and I had an interesting exchange about this. I take him at his word that he didn't see the sort of policy connection, if you like. Certainly on the other side, though, at the ACTU, Combe, it's very clear. Combe says this, but it's also clear from the way that they ran the campaign that they learnt a lot about getting out early. And in fact, Combe also talks about how he learnt from Reith that you need to get out early, back in 1996. With the very first changes, because the new Howard government in 96 hit the ground running on workplace changes and trying to shape public opinion, and the ACT was caught flat-footed there, and he resolved then, he's a much more junior office bearer in the ACTU, that this would never happen again. So, I mean, the ACTU basically began in almost virtually from the start of that fourth term to put together a very, very effective campaign.
Thank you. And question over here from Emma.
Hi, Emma James. Assuming that we agree with the statement that the policy was sound of work choices, do you think that if there had been a stronger sales pitch as such, and the policy had been completed in a quicker turnaround, that it would have had a change of the outcome of the 2007 election?
Maybe not. Maybe not. There was definitely its time factor going on. I actually think, I was very interested with what Michael was saying before about Kevin Rudd and the change of leader, but there was a sort of sea change in opinion when Kim Beazley was forced to make way for Kevin Rudd, rightly or wrongly, that just seemed to give the Labor Party an unassailable lead. It was helped by work choices, but definitely the time lag was a real problem, because interestingly, even though it was work choices was a deregulatory piece of legislation, it was a very, very voluminous piece of legislation because it was about changing everything, all these different things, and it had to regulate things quite tightly to create this new system. That's what took time. I mean, I think, as I recall, there were 50 lawyers working on drafting that legislation, and they had to bring in people from law firms, like I think 10 of them came from outside firms, because there just weren't enough legislative draftsmen, women, to put it together in the time they needed, to canvass everything that was needed to make it work and hold together.
Fiona Wade.
Fiona Wade, given the percentage of union participation has dropped so much, this is kind of looking into the future. What for the Labor Party now?
Yes, well, that's right. See, it has enormous political dimensions now, the problems with the union movement, because once you get down to the numbers that they're at, when you only have 9% of private sector workers belonging to unions, you're really struggling to reflect the broad mass of your community. Add that to the fact that hardly anybody joins political parties anymore, then, you know, you end up with politicians who look like just political operatives, trying to please themselves and operating in a sort of weird bubble, if I can borrow that term. I can't remember who uses that word, bubble, but might be the current Prime Minister. But I mean, that's how you look, that's how the Labor Party will look, and I think it could quite well be that deeper analysis of the May election result might show that this was one of the problems. A generation or two back, there was no problem that the former president of the ACTU, Bob Hawke, was running as Labor leader and Prime Minister, but there was a problem for the Labor Party to have the former National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, I think, as its leader for the past two elections.
And can you respond to Michael Danby's point about nemesis and hubris?
That's an that's a really, really challenging question, because I think we want conviction politicians. No one could say that the policies that were contained inside work choices were a John Howard brain fart. You know, they were something that he held all the way through his career. So don't we want our political leaders to actually operate on their beliefs? I think this was their chance. And the Labor Party, so I have a slightly different view about the Beazley thing to Michael. I mean, I always felt it was Kim Beazley who had the rampant ambition. He had two elections. He was allowed to just take the Labor Party to two elections, lost both, gave up the leadership, and then handed over to Simon Crean. And within a year, he had the Roosters, Smith, Swan, Conroy, undermining Crean, in favour of Beazley. You know, Beazley, Latham was the spoiler candidate against Beazley. Even that wasn't enough to vanquish his ambition. He still wanted to come back again, which he did in 2005. So I always felt that the Labor Party was shot under Kim Beazley. I didn't think they had any chance at all of winning and beating this man here in 2007 at all. And fortunately, we'll never know. But,
Phil Baresi.
Sean, Phil Baresi.
Hi, Phil.
One of the 21 seats.
Sorry.
That disappeared. And also at the forefront of some of the debate at the time. One of the interesting things about that Your Rights at Work campaign, which was very successful, and in a way we helped it to be successful by giving it such a long period of gestation to take place, was a grassroots campaign. It was phenomenal. It was also the start of the Get Up movement, I understand, at that time. So, and from then we have actually seen that that politics, when it comes from the grassroots, has a chance of unseating governments. Do you think that's the way of the future in terms of Australian politics? And just by wayside, one thing which people perhaps do not know is that the union movement was about to ditch the Your Rights at Work campaign very early on. They had to be convinced to keep it going.
Because it costs money.
Yes.
It's expensive and they didn't like the idea. There was a lot of internal debate inside the ACTU about whether they really wanted to make the decision to be a campaigning outfit rather than a trade union movement and a political partner of, or an industrial partner of the Labor Party. It definitely worked for them then, and I think Get Up as well has had an impact sort of that's been positive in terms of their own aims as well in that time, but not in 2019. Both failed dismally, like completely dismally, like so yes, they definitely offer hope, you know, grassroots motivated on the ground campaigns, you know, making phone calls, knocking on doors, all that can work, but only if it's done well, and it wasn't done well at all in this most recent election. I mean, just a disaster, essentially, for both Get Up and the ACTU, I would think. And it will be interesting to see how those organisations, maybe less Get Up, but more with the ACTU, how they approach their campaigning efforts in the future. I suspect there'll be more debates about that as well internally. There'll be more pushback against just spending these millions and millions of dollars for no return.
Well, Shaun Carney models himself what he promotes, which is a candour and honesty. We've had his views of a difficult issue and his own movement through the intellectual landscape that is industrial relations. Would you please thank Shaun this afternoon?